By the end of the last video, we knew this truck needed some serious drivetrain work. So in this episode, we'll get started with that work. First, we spent some time cleaning up the garage to have enough room in there to pull in the Silverado. The truck has been used as storage for some things and shade for others, so we'll have to clear out some of that stuff. However, since there won't really be room anywhere else, for now, the engine and transmission are going to stay in the bed. Next up, we actually have to get the truck into the garage. However, reverse is so far gone at this point, it will not make it up the driveway. So we'll use our friendly neighborhood S10 instead. Since I didn't have anyone to sit in the Silverado and hold the brakes at the time, I simply set the parking brake in the pickup so that the truck wouldn't roll on its own. With the tow strap attached and the pickup in neutral, the Blazer had no problems moving the larger truck. Then we can throw it back in park and unhook the two trucks. The lights on top of the light bar in the bed do need to come off in order for it to fit in the garage, but luckily when I put everything together I made sure that was an easy process. There are just two electrical connectors and two large bolts. Then we can start up the Silverado and just roll it into the garage in first gear. It's definitely a tight fit, but the truck does make it into the garage. And then we'll get started right away by removing the splash guard and putting the truck on jack stands. In order to get everything high enough, we had to use wooden boards to get a little bit of extra lift out of the jack and have the jack stands near their highest settings. If you ever use boards or wooden blocks to lift something like this, be very careful while doing it. If the ground isn't flat or something shifts, those boards can come tumbling off and the vehicle will slam to the ground. For the back end, we'll just put the jack stands under the axle to keep everything high in the air. And then we'll get started with the disassembly. This is a very involved process, and for the sake of time, I was not able to film everything in great detail. But through this time lapse, we'll follow through the basic steps. For the most part, once you roll under there and take a good look, you can pretty much figure it out for yourself. Some steps are very fiddly and you'll have to get a little creative, but as long as you take your time and make sure you don't forget to unhook anything, it's a fairly straightforward, if a bit labor-intensive, job. We started off by removing the exhaust at the Y-pipe. There are two nuts up front and then the rear was just held in by exhaust hangers. And next up we'll remove the Y-pipe. Unfortunately, this step became a fairly long and involved process because the nuts holding the Y-pipe to the manifold were severely seized and are a little tricky to get to.
So I'm removing these nuts so I can take the Y-pipe off, but they're very stuck. I have gotten 5 of them loose. The other 2 are just hanging the thing up there so it won't fall off once I do get it loose. But the last one, I couldn't get the socket on straight and it rounded it off.
And when I say I rounded it off, I mean that thoroughly. It is very stuck and now very round. These things were really stuck. The big 1/2-inch impact only got 2 of them loose on its own. What I did for the others was hit them with the impact gun and then the breaker bar and then the impact gun, and it took them right off. That worked right up until this one where the socket wasn't on at a perfect angle and it just chewed a corner off. And then I gave it 2 or 3 more goes and it was still too stuck and it just rounded right off in the socket. It was not a small amount of force to do that. So I could probably try to get an extractor socket on there, but what I did was take out the fender liner so that I could get in there and just use the angle grinder to cut it off. I had already removed the O2 sensor to try to get the socket on there in the first place, so I just taped over the bung to make sure to not get any pieces of steel in there. So that's how I ended up, leaning over a tire, cutting off that exhaust stud with an angle grinder. I tried to just cut through the nut and separate it at first, but eventually just gave up on that and cut through the whole stud. Once it was off, a little bit more grinding and a few taps with the hammer and everything separated. And finally, the Y-pipe could be removed. But in order for the Y-pipe to come off, we have to remove the transmission crossmember. First, we can remove the nuts holding the transmission mount to the crossmember, and then remove the 4 large bolts and nuts holding the crossmember to the frame. I didn't have a good way to put the impact gun on these, so it was definitely a bit of an arm workout removing those 4 large lock nuts. Once the nuts have been removed, we can lift up the drivetrain just a little bit by jacking up from the transfer case, and then slide out the bolts and drop out the crossmember. And at last we can get that Y-pipe out of the way. We'll put the crossmember back up there and just not tighten it down in order to get the jack out of the way so that we have more space for working. Next up, it was time for my transmission fluid bath, so we unbolted the transmission pan to drain out as much fluid as possible. It's been maybe 20,000 miles since dropping the pan and changing the transmission fluid, but the fluid is a bit dark. There's some material at the bottom of the pan, but nothing too unusual. Once everything has been allowed to sit there and drip for a little while, we'll bolt the transmission pan back on, and then remove the drain plug from the transfer case to empty it out as well. There was a lot of metal in there, in the fluid that came out and the magnet on the drain plug. This was a big clue to what was actually going on. If the transmission was having some sort of spline slipping issue, you would sure expect to see some metal in the transmission pan and especially on that pan magnet, but there did not appear to be anything in that pan. Yet the transfer case had its fair share of shavings. The transmission was sounding less and less like the culprit of the issue, and the transfer case more and more. But at this point, we were already set on taking everything out of the truck and rebuilding the transmission. So we'll continue with the process of removing it. So next we can unbolt the rear drive shaft and get it out of the way, and just going around unhooking everything we can. There are several electrical connectors, hoses, and the transmission cooler lines that need to be disconnected. And then we can remove the crimped on clamps holding on the boot for the front drive shaft, unbolt it, and get it out of the way. Then we'll continue removing everything we can, including the starter, in order to remove the torque converter bolts. These bolts are real tight for good reason and a bit hard to get to. It helps immensely to have somebody else hold the crankshaft still with a ratchet while you remove these bolts. Next up are the bolts and studs that hold the bell housing to the engine. I was hoping that this being a full-size truck meant they'd be easier to get to, but that's not really the case. It took a lot of creativity, careful positioning, and a bit of luck to get everything removed. We'll leave 2 of those in very loosely for now to make sure nothing falls on our heads. Getting the crossmember out of the way and using the transmission jack to raise and lower everything can help get you that tiny bit of extra space you need to get a socket in there. The next thing to do is simply pull the transmission off of the engine and lower it down from the truck. Well, maybe simply wasn't the right word, because the dowel pins, which locate the transmission to the engine, are severely seized in place. We tried penetrating fluid, heat, prying, kicking, and a lot of swearing, but nothing was able to get the transmission to budge. We were definitely not gentle about it, but we couldn't even get anything to move a millimeter. We had to call it a night, and it would be a few days before I got back to this job. Several times a day, I would spray it with some PB Blaster or WD-40, heat up the aluminum around the dowel pins with a torch, and kick it a few times. We placed a thin board between the engine oil pan and the front crossmember and basically let the drivetrain hang there for a while in the hope that the weight of it might get things moving. Several days and a whole lot of heat and oil later, we were back at it and trying to get this thing separated. At one point we even used a large ratchet strap while prying on things to try to get it separated. At this point I had asked around for advice and was told an air hammer was the way to go. I was a bit afraid of cracking the bell housing or something by doing that, so that was going to be my last resort. After another hour of heat and prying and hammering a chisel in, finally a gap was forming. Yes. It was definitely exciting seeing that millimeter of light. After that, it was basically more of the same for a while, hammers and chisels and screwdrivers prying that gap open more and more until everything was finally far enough apart to be separated. We've removed the last 2 bolts holding things together, and with one last tug, we were finally able to separate the engine and transmission. Then begins the careful dance of tilting and lowering and tilting and lowering and maneuvering everything out of the way. Eventually everything was low as it was going to be, but we still had to pick up the tail end of the jack to get everything under the frame rail. But it was finally done. The drivetrain was successfully removed from the truck. There was a bit of tidying up to do, and then we lowered the truck back down and pushed it back out of the garage. We used the engine crane to lift the whole assembly off of the jack so that we could use it to remove the transfer case. Once that was secured to the jack, we've removed the bolts holding the extension housing onto the transmission. We used the impact gun to remove bolts it could reach, and an old-fashioned wrench to remove ones it couldn't. Eventually, all the bolts were out and we were able to pull the 2 apart. And, as can be expected, make a pretty big mess in the process. But at least the drain pan was there to catch the last 5 drips. With that out of the way, we cleared up some space and used the engine crane to lift the transmission onto the workbench. For this job, you definitely want to have a big workspace, really as much as possible. And of course, you want to keep everything, including your tools and hands, as clean as possible throughout the whole thing. Automatic transmissions use some very precise valving, and even small particles can cause issues. If you use rags, only use lint-free ones. I generally use paper towels, but you do have to watch out for lint on sharp corners. But with that said, a little paper towel lint is much better than lint or string from a rag. It also helps to have either printouts or a computer nearby that you can use to reference torque specs and search forums for information if you have any questions. It's also helpful to have a guide to follow along with. Either a digital rebuild guide or an old textbook one can really help keep you organized. And with that, we're finally ready to start disassembling this transmission. At this point, we were pretty sure the transmission wasn't the main problem, but we weren't sure it wasn't causing some of the weird shift issues. The truck only has around 80,000 miles on it, and it's only 11 years old, so even though it's had a rough life, it should not be in need of a transmission rebuild just yet. But despite that, here we are. Over the next few episodes, we'll go pretty in-depth into rebuilding this transmission. So let's just get this out of the way. Was there anything wrong with the transmission? No. But we're here, we already have the parts, and I had previously told you all we would film this transmission rebuild, so let's get to work. A job like removing a transmission should really be an all-hands-on-deck kind of process, so I really appreciate that even our small multi-legged friends kept coming to help out.